Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guests today are writers Morgan Thomas and Claire Luchette. Morgan Thomas earned their MFA in 2016 from the University of Oregon's Creative Writing Program. Afterward, they went to Mongolia as a Fulbright Fellow. Thomas was the 2022 recipient of Lambda Literary's Judith Markowitz Award for Exceptional New LGBTQ+ Writers, and has also received support from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference and a Southern Studies Fellowship in Arts and Letters. Thomas's work has appeared in The Atlantic, American Short Fiction, the Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. Thomas's debut collection, Manywhere Stories, published in 2022, was a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, Lambda Literary's Transgender Fiction Prize, the LA Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, and Publishing Triangle's Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction. They are currently a Shearing Fellow at the Black Mountain Institute at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Claire Luchette earned their MFA in 2017 from the University of Oregon's Creative Writing Program. They are an assistant professor of creative writing at Binghamton University in New York. Luchette was a 2022-23 Rona Jaffe Fellow at the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. They've received grants and support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing, MacDowell, Yaddo, and the James Merrill House, among others. Luchette's fiction and nonfiction has appeared in Best American Short Stories, VQR, Plowshares, the New York Times, Granta, Kenyon Review, Glimmer Train, Iowa Review, and Indiana Review. Their novel, Agatha of Little Neon, was published in 2021. Thomas and Luchette gave readings at the U of O on January 10th, 2024, as guests of the Creative Writing Program. Thank you both for coming on the show. It's great to have you with us. So you each earned an MFA, as I said, from Creative Writing at U of O. Looking back, how did your graduate experience impact your identity and practice as writers?
I can go first. The University of Oregon MFA was the first time that I thought of myself as a writer in a really serious way. I studied biology primarily as an undergraduate, and it wasn't until I got to the MFA program that I realized it was possible to be a writer professionally and started to take that practice really seriously. And so I think in that sense, the time that I spent at the University of Oregon was really formative, and it also introduced me to a community of writers, both faculty and fellow MFA students, who still help me to read and edit my work and challenge my ideas about fiction and craft, and I feel very grateful for that community.
Yeah, the community aspect of the MFA program was wonderful, and the time to write, I think, went a long way in helping me develop the confidence to, as Morgan said, call myself a writer. And I think it helped me understand how long a game it is to write, and how much permission you have to give yourself to revise, which is really just another way of saying changing your mind. And that has been a really beautiful takeaway for me, not just in writing, but in general in life.
Interesting. So Morgan, let's start with you. Tell us a bit about your background and how you came to be a writer.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I have always been really interested in science and biology, and it wasn't until I started the MFA that I really thought about myself as a writer. However, I've always written stories and poems ever since I was a very young child. It's been a way for me of asking questions in a sustained way and considering the world around me and the parts of it that I don't understand. And I think that tool was really useful for me, for all of my life. And so it felt like, in some ways, from a subject matter standpoint, a real sort of diversion from the path that I had thought I would take in biology when I decided to do the MFA. But I think at the same time, it was really a continuation of this way of approaching the world, and writing being such a part of that.
Say a little bit about your background, where you're from.
Oh, sure. I'm from, I was born in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas. I lived there until I was 10, and then I moved to Gulf Breeze, Florida, which is just outside Pensacola, in the northwest part of Florida, and lived there and went to college in Florida as well.
So all the stories in the volume, well, almost all the stories in the volume take place in the southern part of the U.S., in the Gulf Coast area. Do you think of yourself as a Southern writer? I mean, I know you live in Portland. Do you think of yourself as a Southern writer?
Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly. I think that anytime I sit down to write, I tend to find myself back in the South, even though I'm not living there currently. That landscape is very much a part of me, and I think a part of my stories. And I also think that one of the things that I was trying to do in Manywhere, and that I'm still thinking about as I write fiction, is to sort of find a place for myself as a genderqueer person in the sort of mythos of the South. I think there are myths that the South tells about itself, that it's a place where neighborliness overcomes bigotry, or that it's a place that has itself overcome histories of genocide and slavery. And I think those are myths. And then there are also myths that the rest of the country tells about the South. I think Jesmyn Ward speaks really beautifully about this when she says, I'm paraphrasing, but that Mississippi is like the place that people point to when they don't want to notice the racism that's happening where they are living. And I think both of those, I sort of hold both of those sets of myths and then try in my fiction to imagine a place where I, as a settler who's genderqueer, can find a life in the South that feels both ethical and joyful. And so I think in that sense, my work does feel like it's engaging with Southernness, especially this book, Manywhere. But I also, I'm not living there currently, and so I do feel tentative about claiming any sort of broader label about myself as a writer.
Perfectly understandable. Would you read us a passage from the book?
Sure, happily. I'll just read from the beginning. The story is called Taylor Johnson's Lightning Man. October 2008. I'm here in the photo booth on Ellis Island, waiting for you, Lightning Man. You're sailing from London on the ocean liner New York. Your ship docks in 1 hour, 100 years ago. We'll miss each other by a century, I know. It doesn't matter to me. I'm here anyway, waiting. I have something to tell you. After you disembark, follow signs to the gift shop. I'm on the first floor, near the water fountains, past the ladies. Make a right at the elevator. The medical ward where you spent most of your time on the island is closed to visitors now. The room where you argued your case before the Board of Special Inquiry is locked, visible only through glass windows. But the site where you had your photograph taken on Ellis Island is open to tourists, marked by a photo booth. There is still one camera on Ellis Island, and I'm sitting in front of it. I'll meet you here. I'm wearing a Homburg with a stiff brim and a suit just like yours. The tourists mistake me for a living exhibit, a reenactor. Who are you, they ask me. I tell them to guess. I came up on the train, 2 days spent on the rails you once rode the other way. This morning I told my mother I was taking a ferry to Ellis Island. She said, we didn't come through that way. It was Canal Street for us. I know, I said. There's no one up there for you, she said, hanging up. But I haven't come looking for family. I've come to meet you, Lightning Man. As this is the lightning rod season, it is the opportune time to put the homeowner on his guard against the wiles of one lightning rod man who is now going his rounds in the lower wards, equipped with a reel of twisted white ribbon, some alleged insulators, a few gilded points and spikes, and an enormous quantity of impudent loquacity. From the Louisiana Electrical Review, January 30th, 1909. You protected us from fires. My mother invoked you when the weather turned, when hard rain shorted our window units, when jellyfish sucked up into Gulf Power's turbines fried the circuitry and we lived for days in the dark, when the generator at the corner of Lee and Empire blew, when the neighbor girl dropped her hairdryer into the kitchen sink and the surge protectors tripped one after another down the row of flats, my mother said, "Where's that lightning man?" When a storm tracked off the Gulf to New Orleans, she didn't call on Jesus. She clasped her hands in front of the standing fan and she said, "Hear us, lightning man." We climbed into the bathtub, put the mattress there on top, and hunched against it for breathing room. We listened to shingles pull away from the roof, to the trees outside popping like cans, to the Kesey family next door singing Hosanna, crammed into their tub, same as us. We said, "Come on, lightning man, knock at our door, lightning man, keep us safe, lightning man, we're calling you." After, in the giddy, permissive days following any storm, I used bungee cords for jump ropes. I skipped with the other kids, singing, lightning man, where's your rod?" We tapped Coast Guardsmen on the shoulder to whisper the question and ran, shrieking. We couldn't have said why it was funny, but we were certain it was. We made our own lightning rods. We lashed coat hangers to the gutter. We tied Christmas ornaments to brooms with butcher's twine and dangled them out windows. If the ornament twisted left, a storm was coming. If it twisted right, our mamas were. We all knew your story. We'd heard it from our mothers over dinners of macaroni eaten before the standing fans. The year was 1920. You appeared in a thunderstorm on the porch of the landlord's flat. You held a staff of iron from which hung a crystal ball, the sort used for divination. You knocked. The landlord mistook your knocking for thunder. Perhaps your knocking was thunder. You let the thunder do your knocking for you. You sold lightning rods, iron rods, $1 a foot, the glass balls you'd throw in free. 4 rods would cover the flats, protect them from lightning fires, 40 feet of iron, $40. The landlord refused. The landlord was warded, pimpled, bespectacled, every kind of ugly. The landlord was tight as a mule's ass with his money. 1 year later, the flats caught fire. Inside, 24 people, women and children. 4 rods would have covered the flats, $40. Most ended the story there with a suck of air through their teeth, one shake of the head. We may be stingy, but we aren't cheap. Not my mother. My mother went on. You died in 1932, she said. You were entombed in St. Louis Cemetery No. 3, east of New Orleans. The undertaker, when he stripped your body for embalming, discovered you had been all along a woman costumed with a man's suit and a smoker's cough, a Canadian with no U.S. citizenship and no family to speak of. My mother liked your story because she thought it illustrated the progress made by women of her generation. These days, you wouldn't have to hide that way. You could sell a lightning rod wearing a skirt, might sell more. I liked your story because I suspected even then you weren't a woman or a man. You were a lightning man with a knock like thunder. I felt close to you.
Thank you so much. As that story suggests, you've done some historical research in writing these stories. So say a little bit about that research and how it impacted the writing of the stories.
Yeah, so all of these stories were written as I was seeking in the archives the genderqueer community that at that time I hadn't found around me, and I felt really rejuvenated and excited by the idea that these people had lived full lives centuries ago, and I saw in them like queerness or transness or the possibilities of it. And I wanted to write into that because I felt this connection. And I think you ask how it impacts the stories. I think the answer to that is that as I started to write the stories and write into that perceived connection, I realized how fraught it was. I realized that I couldn't actually impose a label like queer or genderqueer on Frank Woodhull, who lived in 1908, well before modern queer discourse emerged. And a lot of the craft choices that I made in these stories had to do with my attempt to navigate that difficulty and that sense of like both wanting to claim this kinship, this connection, also recognizing that that desire was mine and was almost certainly a distortion of history, and that these are stories that have already been distorted through secondary sources in a whole variety of ways, and that I was sort of seeking yet another distortion for myself from these historical characters. So.
That's very interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about why you gave the volume that title, Manywhere?
Yes, this was actually a collaboration with my editor who suggested it, and I think it suggests like expansiveness and possibility, which are two things that I hope the stories are sort of building towards. It's the title of the last story, which I think is the one in which that expansiveness and possibility is sort of most recognized at the very end, and so it fits in that sense. And the only other thing that I like to say about it is that I thought I had made it up, but then I found it in Urban Dictionary, and I was like, oh, this is a word that already exists. So.
I thought you'd made it up too. Wow. These are short stories.
They are.
What are some of the challenges of writing short stories as opposed to writing a novel or other kinds of writing?
I mean, I suppose compression is the challenge, but I love the short form. I find it much more difficult to write a sustained, long form novel. I think that the beauty of a short story is that everything is, and in many of my stories, is sort of pivoting around one central point, moment, turn, realization, however ephemeral or incorrect. And that is just, it works so well, I think, for the stories that I want to tell. And especially in this book, when part of what I wanted to do was just to show a diversity of Southern queer and genderqueer lives. And so I think having these multiple stories in one collection to do that felt like the right choice.
And I think my last question for you is to tell us a little bit about this fellowship you had at the Black Mountain Institute.
Yeah, last semester I was a shearing fellow at the Black Mountain Institute, which is a nonprofit that is affiliated with the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and it was a wonderful experience. I did a little bit of teaching, a community workshop that was really incredible, focused on writing queer and trans ecologies and thinking about ecological storytelling. I was able to do a bit of research in the archives at the University of Nevada there and felt so supported by the Black Mountain Institute staff, so it was a really wonderful opportunity.
Cool. So Claire, we're turning to you now. So tell us a bit about your background and how you came to be a writer.
Yeah, in terms of where I'm from, that question gets harder and harder to answer as I grow and age, but I was born in upstate New York, lived in Cincinnati for some of my childhood, and then we moved to Chicago. And then I have bounced around for the past 11 million years. But yeah, I think my journey to the writing world was a little bit, I don't know, it never felt, it still doesn't feel to me like I'm choosing a career. Instead, it's choosing how to spend my time and what to pay attention to. I was living in New York after college and working as an administrative assistant, and found that I really loved writing emails, of all things. And I wasn't really sure what to do with myself and how to build a future for myself. But I thought that it was good information that I knew that I liked to write emails. And so I wondered how I could keep writing emails, and then write stories and other things too. So I applied to the MFA program here, and it was just a really wonderful way to spend 2 years writing and learning and making friends. And
I think I can say with confidence, no one has ever told me they became a writer because they liked writing emails before.
I know, it was freaky. I mean, so much of the job was terrible that emails were a relief.
So would you read a passage from
Agatha
of Little Neon?
So I'll read from the very first chapter. Mother Roberta made the rules. No chewing gum, no bicycles, no tree nuts, no pets. Every morning she brewed the coffee, and every night she cooked the meal. Twice a year she sewed our made-to-measure habits from yards of a black poly wool blend. She embroidered pillows, made punch from powder, wrote the homilies for the priest. When Father Thaddeus came to Lackawanna, he suggested she might take a break. Relax. She was 81, frail as filament, and had started having bad days. Lapses in memory, slips in the shower. She sometimes peed herself. Twice in 1 month, we'd had to rummage through bags of trash in search of her false teeth. Mother Roberta acquiesced. She would try to relax. She began to spend her days behind a newspaper held wide, or at the kitchen table with a cup of red rose tea, staring at a spread of puzzle pieces that she never seemed to touch. But while we weren't looking, she put all 1,000 pieces where they were meant to be, and one afternoon the puzzle was finished. A moonscape. She left it on the table until dinner, then wrecked it and started again. Everything we knew about living, we knew because Mother Roberta had showed us. She taught us to be busy, write our representatives, make bread of brown bananas. There is no time for nothing, she used to tell us, when she caught us staring out the window or flipping through stations on the rectory radio. Mother Roberta had 3 stiff hairs on her chin that we could spot only when she sat underneath the kitchen light. We used to fight each other for the chance to lean close and tug them loose. The thrill of it, we were eager and she obliged, knowing she was too blind to get them herself. One of us would crouch and raise a pair of tweezers and, when a hair was plucked free, present it in front of Mother Roberta's face so she could close her eyes, make a wish, and blow. It seemed impossible then, in the time before Little Neon and Woonsocket, to imagine chin hairs of our own. The 4 of us were born in different months of the same year, each of us 20 when we became novitiates, 22 when we made our vows. We were 29 when we moved from Lackawanna, just south of Buffalo, to Woonsocket. Back then, our chins were bald and our minds were sharp. Our faith was firm and founded. We were fixed to one another, like parts of some strange, asymmetrical body. Frances was the mouth, Mary Lucille the heart, Therese the legs, and I, Agatha, the eyes. There were a lot of parts missing, I suppose, but for a while we didn't realize it. For a while it seemed like enough. When I was young, I thought womanhood would bring autonomy, glamour, fur coats, and fat wallets, days entirely of my design. I planned as a girl to become the kind of woman who kept a pen in her breast pocket. It seemed important that when I grew up, I always had my own pen, that I never had to borrow anything from anyone else. Now that I'm on my own, the thing I miss most is time spent in a parked van with my sisters, waiting for one of us to root through her bag and find whatever it was the other needed the most.
Thank you so much for reading that. So what led you to write a novel about these 4 29-year-old sisters religious? Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, I was raised Catholic, and at the time that I started writing about nuns, I had spent a lot of time writing about people who were very similar to me, people who took a lot of naps and wept, people whose problems looked like my problems. And I just got really sick of myself. And so I was eager to find a character that I felt like I had authority on, but one that also seemed to offer different experiences and perspectives. And the person that came to mind was Sister Therese, who taught me macroeconomics in high school. And she was really stern and mean and hated me. And so I wondered what it was like to have the conviction that Sister Therese had, and to be sure about how the world worked and what mattered. And so I started writing in this first-person plural perspective, the we voice, about what Sister Therese's world might have looked like when she was young.
So did you do research for this?
A lot of the stuff that I might call research was born of having grown up Catholic. Mm-hmm. But I did speak to a number of women religious on the phone, including not Sister Therese, but the woman who taught my mother history in high school. And she spoke for a long time about her long career as a nun, and how she's seen the church change over time.
Did you speak with any young sisters?
Yeah, I spoke to one woman who was in the process of professing vows, and our biographies overlapped in really significant ways. So I was, I had to come up against a lot of unconscious bias when I was speaking to her, and swallow a lot of what presented as judgment for making that choice.
Fascinating. So Agatha of Little Neon is a belated coming of age novel. Mm-hmm. So why was that a genre that interested you?
Yeah, I think it can take as long as it takes for someone to accept themselves and learn who they are. And so I'm always interested and inspired by stories of people arriving at self-acceptance later in life, and that's very much Agatha's experience. You
mentioned that you started writing it in first person plural, and one of your stories is in first person plural too, which is not a common point of view. What made you switch to first person singular?
Yeah, I think it was hard to sustain that perspective over the scope of a novel. Hard to keep that going, and I think ultimately Agatha kind of like announced herself to me as a character whose experience and point of view was most kind of pressing and important here. When I read the bit about how all of the sisters are parts of the same body, it seemed natural that Agatha, as the eyes, would be the one to tell this story.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, you might say that it starts out in a kind of first person plural, and it becomes increasingly first person singular story.
Right, right.
Yeah, so it's such an interesting book, such a really good read. You are an assistant professor at Binghamton University. So how do you teach creative writing? What do you do?
Yeah, I think that I used to think when you taught creative writing that you had to enter the classroom with all of these answers and all of these like tidy, serviceable takeaways for students. But I think I've come to see it as students asking questions, and I help them ask better questions, and I ask questions too, and we kind of probe the unknown together.
So I interviewed Matthew Dickman last term, who's a visiting writer in the creative writing program this term, and I asked him this question. He's like, I don't believe in workshops. I don't believe in writing workshops. What do you feel about writing workshops? I mean, this is a question you could both speak to.
Yeah.
What do you think about writing workshops?
I think when they work, they're wonderful.
What happens when they don't work?
When they don't work, they can be dispiriting and overwhelming. But I think that's part of the process too, is learning what feedback to dismiss and what not to listen to when you're writing.
Is that something that you help with as a teacher?
Absolutely, yeah. Part of what I'm doing is helping students see, who are the writers that are doing what they want to do, and how can I point them in that direction rather than some, other predetermined direction. So
do they read a lot of other writers in your courses?
Absolutely, yeah. I assign a range of published work.
And that's fairly typical at U of O, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's one of the things about our creative writing program. It really is a program that teaches you about the history of literature as well as the practice of writing. Yeah. So you're both here as guests of the creative writing program. You're reading, but reading isn't the only thing our guests do when they're here. So tell us a little bit about what you guys are up to while you're on campus.
Yeah, we just met with the current University of Oregon MFA grad students in fiction writing for lunch, and after this we will be chatting with the undergraduate students who are part of the KID program in creative writing here, and then a reading this evening. Am I missing anything?
No, yeah. This was really the highlight, of course.
Yeah. Okay, whatever you say. Say a little bit about what it was like to be with these MFA students now that you are not MFA students at the University of Oregon.
Good question. I think, yeah, it's hard to give writing advice because it sounds like life advice a lot of the time, and no life advice. Meeting someone and then immediately giving them life advice is just not a good plan or a cool look either. But it was really great to meet with the students because it reminded me of the joy of being here and how inspiring a time it can be.
Do you want to add anything to that, Morgan?
I think that sums it up. Yeah, it was a little bit strange, I think, to return to a place that I haven't been in 7 years, and to sort of imagine myself again, like at that same pizza place on the opposite side of the table, like talking to a writer who I found like intimidating. So yeah, it was a strange experience, but I really enjoyed the conversation with them.
So are you each willing to say a little bit about what you're working on now? Since these books are, obviously they've been out, they're getting praise. What are you working on now?
Yeah, I'm writing a novel set during the 1970 mail strike, when for 8 days postal workers refused to deliver the mail.
What drew you to that?
I love the mail.
Oh, email and
Yes, apparently that's a theme.
Interesting. How about you, Mark?
I'm working on a novel that tracks the sort of migration of a genderqueer ecologist and their sibling west from Northwest Florida due to reasons of climate and politics out towards the West Coast, and thinking of it, drawing deliberately and very loosely on the Grapes of Wrath, and thinking of it as a sort of genderqueer counter-narrative and also a 21st century sort of counter-narrative to that, that book of weather-driven migration.
And what about the shift from short stories to novel? What does that seem like a natural transformation for you, a natural progress?
The novel is actually, it's not a direct expansion, but one of the stories in this book, That Drowning Place, thinks about a sort of similar movement, and I was writing that story and realized that there was a lot that I had left unexplored and that it felt like a bit of a too simple gloss of a very complex phenomenon, and so it was in part wanting to dig more into that led me to write the novel. But yeah, it doesn't feel like a natural, I'm going to be very excited to again start writing short stories. The novel still feels like quite a difficult form for me.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, so this will be my last question, a question for each of you. Is there something that you've read recently, and it doesn't have to be recently written, that you would recommend to our viewers as something they've got to read?
Yeah, my friend Alex Tanner's book, Worry, is out in March. It's hilarious and delightful and probably the best book I've ever read. I'll say it.
I recently really enjoyed Jamie Lynn's The Night Parade. I thought it was beautiful, both as an object and as a work of memoirs. So yeah.
So you spoke of it as an object, and let's just talk a little bit about your two objects here. Say a little bit about these covers. They're both beautiful.
Yeah, my journey to this cover was a long one. I initially said that I didn't want a pink book and I didn't want women on it. Now I've got 4 women on a bright pink book. But I'm really, really happy with how the cover turned out. I've learned how difficult it is to communicate about images and covers and how to react to them with language. But this is a really happy result for me.
This was like the first, I had very little input, and this was the first image that was offered to me, and I love it. So I feel like I got lucky. I know a lot of writers who have had very different experiences, but yeah.
Well, thank you both for talking with us today. It's been a real pleasure listening to you read and reading your 2 works and having you with us. Welcome back, and thanks again.
Thanks
so much.
I've been speaking with the writers Morgan Thomas and Claire Luchette, alumni of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Oregon. They gave readings at the U of O on January 10th, 2024 as guests of the Creative Writing Program. Thanks so much for watching.